Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive into history's most fascinating human experiments. Tonight we're stepping into the Soviet Union, where standing in line wasn't just shopping, it was a competitive sport, and where your refrigerator might outlast 3 governments, but good luck finding anything to put inside it. Before we begin this journey through the land of 5-year plans and permanent shortages, hit that like button if you're ready for some historical reality checks, and subscribe if you want more stories about how ordinary people survived extraordinary systems. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing our global community come together to explore these wild chapters of human history. Now grab something warm to drink, get comfortable, and let's dive into a world where toilet paper was currency. Friendship networks were more reliable than government institutions, and somehow, against all odds, people found ways to live, laugh, and maintain their sanity in the most bureaucratically absurd society ever created. This is the story of what life was really like in the Soviet Union. Not the propaganda version, not the Western stereotype, but the messy, complicated, surprisingly human reality that 70 million people called home. If you've ever complained about waiting in line at the DMV for 3 hours, just be thankful you weren't queuing for toilet paper in 1980s Moscow. Because in the Soviet Union, standing in line wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a national sport, an art form, and occasionally a philosophy degree in patience. The queue, or orchard, as the Russians called it, was where democracy went to die, and where Soviet citizens learned that time, much like everything else under communism, belonged to the state. Picture this, it's 5 a.m. in Leningrad, and Valentina Petrovna is already dressed and ready for battle. Not against fascist invaders or capitalist infiltrators, but against the greatest enemy known to Soviet man, the empty store shelf. She's heard through the neighborhood grapevine that mystical network of babushkas more efficient than any intelligence agency, that magazine No. 15 might, just might, have received a shipment of Bulgarian shoes. Not good shoes, mind you, not fashionable shoes. Just shoes that weren't made from cardboard and false hopes. By 6 a.m., there are already 40 people ahead of her. By 7 a.m., there are 200 behind her. Welcome to the Soviet economy, where supply and demand met in a dark alley and supply got mugged. The line becomes a microcosm of Soviet society, a temporary community bound together by shared suffering and the faint hope that whatever they're queuing for actually exists and isn't just a cruel rumor started by some party official's bored nephew. But let's back up a bit. How did the world's largest country, spanning 11 time zones and blessed with enough natural resources to make Saudi Arabia weep with envy, end up with citizens treating a tube of toothpaste like buried treasure? Well, it's complicated. But then again, so was everything in the Soviet Union. The USSR was a grand experiment in human organization that began with noble intentions and ended with people hoarding sugar like it was cryptocurrency. The story really begins in 1917, when a bunch of revolutionaries decided that centuries of Tsarist rule were, to put it mildly, not working out so great for the average Russian. Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik buddies had this radical idea: what if, instead of having rich people own everything, nobody owned anything? Or rather, what if everybody owned everything collectively through the benevolent guidance of the Communist Party? It sounded beautiful in theory, like communism always does. In practice, it meant that your great-grandfather's farm now belonged to everyone, which somehow meant it belonged to no one. Which somehow meant it belonged to whatever bureaucrat was having the worst day at the Ministry of Agriculture. The Soviet system was built on a simple premise. Central planning could organize an economy better than the chaotic forces of capitalism. Instead of letting greedy individuals decide what to produce based on what people actually wanted, wise party officials would determine what everyone needed and produce exactly that amount. It was economic planning with the confidence of a teenager who thinks they've figured out love, and the execution skills of that same teenager trying to plan a surprise party. The results were, to be charitable, mixed. The USSR did manage to industrialize at breakneck speed, turning a largely agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse capable of putting the first human in space. But it also created an economy where you could build rockets that reached the stars while struggling to manufacture a reliable can opener. The Soviet Union mastered nuclear physics, but never quite figured out how to make bread that didn't taste like it was baked with equal parts flour and existential despair. Let's return to Valentina, still standing in that line, because if we're going to understand Soviet life, we need to understand the cue. She's brought a small folding stool, a thermos of tea that's more hot water than tea, and a well-worn copy of War and Peace. Because if you're going to wait for consumer goods, you might as well improve your mind. The woman behind her, Elena Mikhailovna, is knitting what appears to be either a sweater or a very ambitious potholder. The man in front, Boris Ivanovich, is playing chess with himself on a magnetic board because Soviet citizens had to make their own entertainment, and Netflix wouldn't be invented for another 40 years. This wasn't just about shopping. This was about resource allocation in a system where resources were allocated by people who had never run a lemonade stand, let alone an economy. The central planners in Moscow, sitting in their offices with portraits of Marx and Lenin watching disapprovingly, would decide that Leningrad needed exactly 10,000 pairs of shoes this month. Not 9,999, not 10,001, but exactly 10,000. Never mind that maybe 15,000 people needed shoes. Or that half those shoes would be the wrong size. Or that they'd arrive 3 weeks late because the truck driver had stopped to help his cousin repair a tractor in Smolensk. The planners worked with 5-year plans. Those ambitious documents that read like fan fiction written by economics professors who had never actually met a consumer. By 1985, they'd proclaim, every Soviet citizen will have access to quality footwear, adequate housing, and the collective joy of knowing they're participating in the inevitable triumph of socialism. Meanwhile, in reality, every Soviet citizen had access to whatever happened to fall off the back of a truck, literally or figuratively. But here's where it gets interesting. Soviet citizens became the world's greatest improvisers. When you can't buy what you need, you learn to make what you can't buy. When you can't make what you need, you learn to find someone who has it and convince them to share. When sharing fails, you learn the ancient Soviet art of blat, the informal network of favors, connections, and mutual scratching that actually kept the country running. Blat was the Soviet Union's shadow economy, the real engine of getting things done. It worked like this: Sergei works at the shoe factory and can occasionally liberate a pair of boots. Natasha works at the grocery store and can sometimes find actual meat behind the counter. Victor repairs televisions and has access to spare parts that officially don't exist. They all know each other, or know someone who knows someone, and through a complex web of favors and IOUs, they manage to live slightly better lives than the official economy would suggest possible. This wasn't corruption in the Western sense. It was survival. When the official channels failed, which they did with the reliability of a Swiss watch running backwards, people had to create their own channels. Your neighbor might not be able to get you a new apartment, but he could get you the right forms to apply for a new apartment. Your cousin couldn't guarantee you'd get the job you wanted, but she could make sure your application didn't disappear into the bureaucratic black hole that consumed most paperwork in the Soviet Union. The housing situation deserves special mention because it perfectly encapsulates the Soviet approach to solving problems. After World War II, when much of the Western Soviet Union resembled the surface of the moon, the government needed to house millions of people quickly and cheaply. Their solution was the communalka, communal apartments where multiple families shared kitchens, bathrooms, and the constant joy of hearing their neighbors' every argument, celebration, and digestive issue. Imagine sharing a kitchen with 3 other families, each with their own designated shelf in the refrigerators. If there was a refrigerator, their own pots and pans, and their own very strong opinions about proper borscht preparation. Privacy was a bourgeois concept anyway, the party said. Real, socialist citizens had nothing to hide from each other. In practice, this meant that everyone knew when the Petrovs were having marital problems, when little Ivan was failing mathematics, and when someone had eaten the last of the black bread without replacing it. The bathroom situation was even more delicate. Nothing builds character like sharing a toilet with 12 other people, especially when toilet paper was as rare as honest politicians and twice as valuable. Soviet citizens became experts at improvisation here too, using everything from old newspapers to, in desperate times, pages from technical manuals about tractor maintenance. Reading material served double duty in the Soviet Union, though Pravda was generally considered too rough for personal hygiene purposes. But let's talk about the newspapers, because they were their own special form of entertainment. Soviet media operated on the principle that reality was whatever the Communist Party said it was, and if reality disagreed, then reality was clearly suffering from false consciousness. Reading Pravda or Izvestia was like reading fantasy novels, except the fantasy was supposed to be your actual life. Workers at the Magnitogorsk steel plant exceed production quotas by 150%, the headlines would proclaim. While workers at the Magnitogorsk steel plant wondered if they were reading about some other factory in some parallel universe where the machinery actually worked. The newspapers were full of stories about heroic tractor drivers, exemplary milkmaids, and factories that produced so much steel that the capitalist world trembled in fear. Meanwhile, in the real world, the heroic tractor drivers were mostly heroically drunk. The exemplary milkmaids were dealing with cows that produced milk with the enthusiasm of a teenager asked to clean their room, and the steel factories were producing steel with the structural integrity of wet cardboard. This disconnect between official reality and actual reality created its own form of Soviet humor. Citizens became masters of reading between the lines, understanding that when the newspaper said, "temporary supply difficulties," it meant, "we've run out of everything again." When they announced, "worker enthusiasm remains high," it meant, "we've run out of vodka too, and now people are really unhappy." Soviet citizens developed an almost supernatural ability to decode bureaucratic language, turning every official announcement into a puzzle that would have challenged Alan Turing. The workplace was another theatre of the absurd. In capitalist countries, people worked because they needed money to buy things. In the Soviet Union, people worked because not working was illegal, but working didn't necessarily mean you could buy things because there often weren't things to buy. This created what economists politely called labor motivation issues, and what workers more accurately called why bother? Soviet factories operated on the principle of full employment, meaning everyone had a job, even if there wasn't necessarily work to do. This led to the famous Soviet saying, "They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work." Some positions existed purely for ideological reasons. Every factory needed its quota of party officials, youth organizers, and people whose job was to organize other people who organized things that didn't need organizing. The result was a workplace culture that would have fascinated anthropologists if they'd been allowed to study it. Workers became incredibly creative at looking busy while accomplishing nothing. They perfected the art of appearing productive during the brief moments when supervisors were around, then returning to more pressing matters like playing cards, discussing last night's hockey game, or planning elaborate schemes to acquire scarce consumer goods. But the real genius of Soviet workers lay in their ability to repurpose industrial resources for personal use. Factory workers didn't just make widgets for the state, they made widgets for themselves, their families, and their networks of black relationships. A machine shop that officially produced ball bearings for tractors might also, unofficially, produce custom fishing lures, improvised household repairs, and wedding rings crafted from industrial steel. The workers called this writing off to waste, or simply the Soviet way. Management, for their part, participated in their own version of creative accounting. Meeting production quotas was more important than producing quality goods. So if the plan called for 10 thousand nails, you produced 10 thousand nails regardless of whether they could actually be hammered into anything. If the quota was measured by weight, you made really heavy nails. If it was measured by quantity, you made really tiny nails. The important thing was hitting the numbers that would be reported to Moscow, where other people would compile them into statistics that would be presented to even more people who would use them to plan next year's impossible quotas. This created an economy that was simultaneously over-producing and under-producing, often of the same items. Factories would churn out millions of left shoes, while other factories produced millions of right shoes. But somehow the two types of shoes never quite met in the same store at the same time. The Soviet Union could produce enough steel to build a bridge to the moon, but couldn't manage to produce enough screws to hold the bridge together. Let's return to consumer goods, because this is where the Soviet system's contradictions became most apparent to ordinary citizens. The USSR was committed to providing for all its citizens' needs, but it had some very specific ideas about what those needs should be. Soviet planners designed products based on what they thought people should want, not what people actually wanted. This led to a fascinating alternate universe of consumer goods that seemed designed by aliens who had heard about human needs secondhand. Soviet televisions, for example, were built like tanks and had approximately the same aesthetic appeal. They were designed to last forever, which they did, broadcasting the same 4 channels with the reliability of sunrise and about as much variety. Soviet refrigerators were engineering marvels that could keep food cold in the Siberian summer and had enough space to store a week's worth of groceries. Assuming you could find a week's worth of groceries to store. Soviet cars were legendary for their simplicity and durability, though comfort and style were clearly considered bourgeois luxuries. The Lada, the Soviet Union's gift to the automotive world, was a car stripped down to its absolute essentials: 4 wheels, an engine, and the structural integrity of a tin filled with optimism. It had no unnecessary features like comfortable seats, effective heating, or paint that wouldn't chip if you looked at it wrong. But it would start in 40-degree weather when German luxury cars were crying frozen tears, and you could fix it with a hammer and some colourful language. This utilitarian approach extended to fashion, where Soviet designers created clothes that prioritized function over form, assuming function included making the wearer look like they're carrying sacks of potatoes. Soviet fashion was democracy in action. Everyone looked equally unfashionable. The standard Soviet suit looked like it had been designed by committee, cut by someone wearing mittens, and sewn together during an earthquake. But it was warm, durable, and available in your choice of grey, darker grey, or brown that looked suspiciously like grey. Women's fashion was particularly challenging in a system that simultaneously celebrated female equality and seemed to believe that femininity was a Western plot to undermine socialist solidarity. Soviet women became masters of improvisation, creating style from standardized components like jazz musicians improvising solos from the same basic scales. A scarf could transform a shapeless dress, a belt could create a waist where none was intended, and a little creativity could turn industrial fabric into something approaching fashion. the black market in Western goods was inevitable and persistent. A pair of Levi's jeans wasn't just clothing. It was a symbol of rebellion, a small victory against the planned economy, and sometimes a better investment than government bonds. Western records, books, and magazines circulated through underground networks with the secrecy of state documents and often more care. Soviet citizens would pay extraordinary sums for items that Westerners took for granted, not because they were necessarily better, but because they represented choice in a system designed to eliminate choices. Education in the Soviet Union was both the system's greatest achievement and one of its most revealing contradictions. Soviet schools produced some of the world's best mathematicians, scientists, and engineers, while simultaneously failing to teach students how to think critically about the society they lived in. Every child learned calculus and classical literature, but questioning why there was no toilet paper in the stores was strictly off limits. Soviet education was comprehensive and free, which was genuinely revolutionary. Every citizen could receive education from kindergarten through university without paying tuition, and many did. The emphasis on technical and scientific education produced generations of highly skilled professionals who could design nuclear reactors and space stations. But the same system that taught advanced physics forbade students from learning about economics as it was actually practiced in the rest of the world. History classes were particularly surreal, teaching a version of events where every Soviet leader, except the recently denounced ones, was a brilliant strategist. Every Soviet victory was inevitable, and every Soviet defeat was either a tactical withdrawal or the result of sabotage by Western intelligence agencies. Students learned about the Glorious Revolution, the heroic struggle against fascism, and the ongoing battle against capitalist imperialism, but somehow never learned about the famines, purges, or the fact that East Germans were building walls to keep people in rather than to keep invaders out. The result was a generation of highly educated people who knew tremendous amounts about some subjects and virtually nothing about others. A Soviet engineer could calculate the stress tolerance of a bridge down to the last bolt, but might genuinely believe that unemployment didn't exist in capitalist countries because their newspapers said so. This selective knowledge created its own cognitive dissonance as people noticed that their lived experience often contradicted what they'd been taught about their society. Universities were particularly strange places where students learned cutting-edge science while attending mandatory classes on Marxist, Leninist philosophy that treated economic theory like religious doctrine. Professors who could explain quantum mechanics with crystal clarity would suddenly become vague and philosophical when discussing why Soviet factories couldn't produce decent shoes. The smartest people in society learned to compartmentalize their knowledge, keeping their technical expertise separate from their political understanding. This compartmentalization extended throughout Soviet intellectual life. Writers, artists, and filmmakers learned to create works that satisfied censors while still expressing something meaningful. They developed elaborate metaphors and allegories, creating art that could be read on multiple levels. A story about a factory worker struggling with a broken machine might really be about a citizen struggling with a broken system. But as long as the worker eventually fixed the machine through collective effort and socialist determination, the censors were happy. Soviet citizens became experts at reading these hidden meanings. They could watch a film about heroic collective farmers and understand that the real message was about the difficulty of maintaining human dignity in an inhuman system. They could read poetry about the beauty of industrial development and hear the poet's actual feelings about environmental destruction and spiritual emptiness. This created a rich underground culture of shared understanding where the most meaningful communication happened in whispers and between the lines. Let's talk about food. because nothing reveals a society's character quite like how it feeds its people. Soviet cuisine was a fascinating mixture of traditional Slavic comfort food, wartime scarcity innovations, and whatever happened to be available at any given moment. The Soviet diet was heavy on potatoes, cabbage, bread, and hope. Lots of hope that tomorrow might bring something different. The average Soviet citizen became an expert at transforming basic ingredients into edible meals through creativity, patience, and occasionally desperate ingenuity. A typical Soviet cookbook would include recipes like cabbage soup, a cabbage water, optimism, potato cutlets, potatoes mashed and fried to resemble something that might once have contained meat, and surprise casserole, so whatever you found in the back of the communal refrigerator that hadn't gone bad yet. Meat was the holy grail of Soviet shopping, appearing in stores with the frequency of solar eclipses and disappearing with similar speed. When word spread that a butcher shop had received a shipment, lines would form faster than you could say, "Workers' paradise." The meat itself was often of mysterious origin and questionable quality. Some citizens suspected it came from animals that had died of natural causes, possibly old age or disappointment with the political system. Soviet sausage, or kolbasa, deserves special mention as one of humanity's greatest achievements in transforming inedible materials into something technically classified as food. Soviet sausage contained meat in the same way that Soviet newspapers contain news. There might be some in there somewhere, but it was heavily processed and mixed with a lot of other stuff. The ingredients were a state secret, possibly to prevent other countries from weaponizing the recipe. Restaurants existed but operated on principles that would have baffled capitalist establishments. Soviet restaurants didn't particularly care whether customers enjoyed their meals or returned for seconds, since they were paid by the state regardless of customer satisfaction. This created dining experiences that were part meal, part endurance test, and part philosophical meditation on the nature of patience. A typical Soviet restaurant meal began with waiting for a table, which might become available sometime before the next 5-year plan. Once seated, diners would receive menus that listed dozens of dishes, about 3 of which were actually available on any given day. The waiter, who had job security that Western workers could only dream of, would inform customers which 90% of the menu was unavailable today, usually due to supply shortages, equipment failures, or what appeared to be deliberate spite. The food, when it finally arrived, was prepared by cooks who understood that their job was to transform raw ingredients into edible substances, not to create anything resembling pleasure. Soviet restaurant meals were functional, like Soviet cars and Soviet furniture. They would sustain life, which was their primary goal. Enjoyment was a bonus, like finding toilet paper in a public restroom. Possible, but not expected. But Soviet citizens weren't just passive victims of their economic system. They developed remarkable resilience, creativity, and community bonds that often amazed outsiders. When official channels failed, people created unofficial ones. When consumer goods were scarce, people learned to make do with less or find alternatives. When privacy was limited, people learned to create mental and emotional spaces that no government could touch. Soviet humor became legendary for its darkness and subtlety. Citizens developed jokes that could express profound political criticism while remaining technically innocent of anti-Soviet sentiment. A joke about a man looking for his lost dog might really be about the futility of finding truth in official media. A story about a broken clock that's right twice a day might be commentary on government promises. Soviet citizens could express entire political philosophies through seemingly innocent anecdotes about everyday life. The communal apartments and shared workspaces that were meant to eliminate individualism actually created tight, knit communities of mutual support. People who were forced to live and work together developed bonds that sustained them through shortages, crackdowns, and the general absurdities of Soviet life. Your communal apartment neighbors might drive you crazy with their habits, but they'd also share their last piece of bread if you were hungry and help you hide contraband books from apartment inspections. Soviet citizens also developed an almost supernatural ability to find joy in small pleasures. A successful shopping expedition that yielded actual meat was cause for celebration. A good book, especially one that wasn't readily available, was treasured like gold. A gathering of friends with a bottle of vodka and some pickled vegetables could become a feast of conversation, laughter, and temporary escape from the difficulties of daily life. The relationship between Soviet citizens and their government was complex and often contradictory. People could simultaneously love their country and hate their system, support socialism in theory, while cursing its implementation in practice. Many believed genuinely in the ideals of equality, workers' rights, and collective welfare, while recognizing that the reality fell far short of the promise. This wasn't the simple oppression of subjects by totalitarian rulers. It was more like a dysfunctional family relationship, where everyone was trapped together and had to make the best of it. Citizens learned to navigate the system, work around its failures, and find ways to live meaningful lives despite its limitations. They became experts at maintaining their humanity in an inhuman system, preserving their individual dignity while participating in collective life. The Soviet workplace culture developed its own ecosystem of informal relationships and unspoken agreements. Workers and managers often collaborated in creative accounting that allowed everyone to meet their quotas, while actually getting useful work done. A factory might officially produce 10,000 units of whatever they were supposed to produce, while also unofficially producing spare parts, household items, and favors for the broader community. Soviet citizens also developed remarkable skills at finding entertainment and meaning in a society that didn't prioritize either. Sports became a national obsession, with ice hockey rivalries that carried more emotional weight than most political elections. Literature remained incredibly important, with people memorizing entire poems and staying up all night discussing the deeper meanings of novels. Music, both official and underground, provided emotional outlets that the political system couldn't touch. The generational differences in Soviet society were particularly fascinating. Older citizens who remembered the revolution, the Civil War, and World War II often maintained genuine faith in the system despite its problems. They had lived through truly horrific times and saw the Soviet Union, whatever its flaws, as an improvement over Czarist autocracy or fascist occupation. For them, having a guaranteed job, free healthcare, and education was genuinely revolutionary, even if the job was boring, the healthcare was basic, and the education was limited. Younger Soviets, especially those born after World War II, had different perspectives. They hadn't experienced the alternatives to Soviet life, so they were more likely to take its benefits for granted while being frustrated by its limitations. They were also more exposed to information about the outside world. Through smuggled books, foreign radio broadcasts, and contact with tourists and foreign students. This generation often developed a more critical view of their society while maintaining deep emotional connections to Russian culture and community. The Soviet Union's relationship with the outside world created its own set of contradictions and curiosities. Soviet citizens were simultaneously told that they lived in the world's most advanced society and that they needed to be constantly vigilant against foreign influences. The outside world was portrayed as both inferior to Soviet society and dangerous enough to require extensive protection against. Foreign tourists were treated like exotic animals in a zoo, fascinating to observe, but potentially dangerous to approach. Soviet citizens who had contact with foreigners were often questioned by authorities, not necessarily because they were suspected of wrongdoing, but because any contact with the outside world was considered potentially contaminating. Yet these same citizens were intensely curious about life beyond Soviet borders, eager for any authentic information about how other people lived. The black market in foreign goods was partly economic, but largely psychological. Owning something from the West wasn't just about having a better product. It was about maintaining a connection to a broader world that the Soviet system tried to shut out. A Western book, record, or piece of clothing represented possibilities that existed beyond the narrow confines of official Soviet life. Technology presented its own contradictions in Soviet society. The USSR could accomplish remarkable technological feats when it focused its resources and attention, putting the first satellite into space and the first human in orbit. But the same society struggled with basic technological applications that Western countries took for granted. Soviet engineers could design space stations, but couldn't figure out how to make televisions that didn't explode or refrigerators that actually kept food cold. This wasn't necessarily due to lack of technical knowledge. Soviet technical education was often superior to Western equivalents. The problems were systemic: lack of quality control, absence of consumer feedback, and economic incentives that rewarded meeting quotas rather than creating useful products. A factory that made 10,000 terrible television sets was considered more successful than one that made 5,000 excellent ones. The Soviet approach to innovation was similarly contradictory. In areas deemed important by the state, military technology, space exploration, heavy industry, Soviet research and development could be brilliant and well funded. In areas that affected ordinary citizens' daily lives, consumer electronics, household appliances, food processing, innovation was slow, underfunded, and often irrelevant to actual needs. Transportation in the Soviet Union embodied many of these contradictions. Soviet cities had excellent public transportation systems, metros, buses, and trams that were cheap, reliable, and comprehensive. Moscow's metro was genuinely one of the world's most beautiful transportation systems, with stations that looked like underground palaces. But the same society that could build magnificent metro systems struggled to produce automobiles that ordinary citizens could afford, and that actually worked reliably. The Soviet airline system was similar. Aeroflot could get you anywhere in the vast Soviet territory, and often in aircraft that were technically advanced and well maintained. But the passenger experience was utilitarian in the extreme, with service that made military transport seem luxurious. Soviet aviation prioritized getting people from point A to point B alive and on schedule, which it generally accomplished. Comfort, convenience, or customer satisfaction were Western indulgences that socialist travelers were expected to live without. Healthcare in the Soviet Union was another study in contradictions. The system provided free medical care to all citizens, which was genuinely revolutionary and remains impressive even by today's standards. Soviet medical education was rigorous and comprehensive, producing doctors who were technically competent and dedicated to their profession. The emphasis on preventive medicine and public health measures was often more advanced than Western approaches. But the quality of care was uneven, and the system suffered from the same bureaucratic inefficiencies that plagued other Soviet institutions. Patients might receive excellent emergency surgery, but have to wait months for routine procedures. Hospitals had skilled doctors, but lacked basic supplies and equipment. The theoretical right to healthcare was universal, but the practical access to quality healthcare often depended on the same informal networks and favor, trading that governed other aspects of Soviet life. Soviet citizens developed their own approaches to healthcare that combined official medical treatment with folk remedies, self-medication, and an impressive knowledge of their own bodies gained through necessity. When medical supplies were scarce, People learned to treat minor ailments themselves. When hospital stays were unpleasant, people learned to recover at home whenever possible. The result was a population that was generally healthy by global standards, but that had learned not to expect too much from their medical system. The role of women in Soviet society was another area of contradictory progress. The Soviet Union was genuinely ahead of most Western countries in providing educational and professional opportunities for women. Soviet women worked as engineers, doctors, scientists, and managers in numbers that wouldn't be matched in the West for decades. The idea that women should have equal access to education and careers was accepted in Soviet society long before it became mainstream elsewhere, but this equality came with its own burdens. Soviet women were expected to work full-time while also managing households and raising children, often without the labor-saving devices that were becoming common in Western homes. The double burden of career and domestic responsibilities was particularly heavy in a society where consumer goods were scarce and household tasks required more time and effort than they might elsewhere. Soviet women also learned to navigate a system where formal equality didn't always translate into practical equality. While women could become doctors or engineers, they were less likely to reach top leadership positions in their fields. The Communist Party leadership remained overwhelmingly male, despite theoretical commitments to gender equality. Women learned to succeed within these limitations, often developing support networks and informal strategies that helped them balance their multiple responsibilities. The Soviet education system's treatment of women was generally progressive, encouraging girls to pursue mathematics, science, and technical subjects that were often discouraged elsewhere. Soviet schools produced generations of women who were comfortable with technical subjects and expected to have professional careers. This created a society where female engineers, doctors, and scientists were common and accepted, even if their career advancement might be limited by other factors. The daily rhythms of Soviet life developed their own patterns that reflected the system's priorities and limitations. People learned to organize their lives around the unpredictable availability of goods and services rather than around personal preferences or convenience. Shopping wasn't something you did when you needed something. It was an ongoing activity that required constant vigilance and opportunistic behavior. Soviet citizens developed remarkable skills at resource management and long-term planning. They learned to buy things when they were available, rather than when they were needed, to store and preserve goods for future use, and to share resources within their communities. A typical Soviet household might look like a warehouse, with supplies of soap, sugar, and other basics stockpiled against future shortages. This created a different relationship with material possessions than existed in consumer societies. Soviet citizens valued durability and functionality over style or novelty. They took care of their belongings because replacement might be difficult or impossible. They learned to repair things rather than replacing them, and to improvise solutions rather than buying new products. The social relationships in Soviet society were shaped by the communal living arrangements and collective work environments that were central to the system. People learned to maintain privacy and individuality within group settings, to cooperate when necessary while preserving their own interests, and to navigate complex social hierarchies that were officially egalitarian, but practically quite stratified. Soviet social gatherings developed their own customs and traditions that blended official ideology with human needs for celebration, relaxation, and emotional expression. Birthday parties, holiday celebrations, and informal get-togethers became opportunities for people to create spaces of genuine joy and community within the broader constraints of their society. The role of alcohol in Soviet society deserves special attention because it served so many functions simultaneously. Vodka was social lubricant, Economic currency, emotional escape, and sometimes political statement all rolled into one clear, potent package. Soviet drinking culture was both cause and effect of the system's problems. People drank because life was difficult, but drinking also made life more difficult, which led to more drinking in a cycle that the government never successfully addressed. Soviet parties, when people could manage to have them, became legendary for their intensity and creativity. When you couldn't buy entertainment, you learned to create your own. When consumer goods were scarce, you learned to find joy in conversation, music, and human connection. Soviet citizens could turn a few bottles of vodka, some pickled vegetables, and a group of friends into celebrations that would be remembered for years. The relationship between official culture and popular culture in the Soviet Union was a constant negotiation between what was permitted and what was desired. Official Soviet culture emphasized collective achievement, socialist realism, and optimistic portrayals of Soviet life. Popular culture, inevitably, included elements that were more critical, more individual, and more emotionally honest. Soviet citizens became experts at creating and maintaining cultural spaces that weren't directly controlled by the state. Kitchen table conversations, private poetry readings, and informal music sessions allowed people to express aspects of their experience that couldn't be acknowledged in public forums. This underground culture wasn't necessarily anti-Soviet, but it was more human and complex than official culture could accommodate. The generational transmission of culture in Soviet society was particularly interesting, because parents had to teach their children how to navigate a system that was officially perfect but practically challenging. Parents had to explain why the newspapers said one thing while reality showed another, why certain topics couldn't be discussed in public, and how to maintain personal integrity while participating in collective activities. Soviet children learned early that there were different levels of truth and different audiences for different kinds of conversation. They learned what could be said at school versus what could be said at home, what could be discussed with friends versus what should never be mentioned to adults. This created a generation that was sophisticated about social navigation and political awareness from an early age. The collapse of the Soviet Union, when it finally came, surprised many observers but probably didn't surprise many Soviet citizens. People who had spent decades learning to read between the lines and navigate bureaucratic failures could see the signs of systemic breakdown that outside observers missed. The system that had managed to function despite its contradictions for 70 years was finally running out of ways to paper over its fundamental problems. But even as the Soviet system collapsed, many of the cultural adaptations and social skills that people had developed remained valuable. The ability to improvise solutions, to maintain community bonds under difficult circumstances, and to find meaning and joy in constrained situations served people well during the chaotic transition to post-Soviet life. The Soviet experience, for all its problems and contradictions, produced people who were remarkably resilient, creative, and community-oriented. They learned to maintain their humanity in an inhuman system, to preserve individual dignity while participating in collective life, and to find ways to live meaningful lives despite political and economic constraints that would have crushed less adaptable societies. Looking back, the Soviet Union seems like a vast experiment in human organization that produced both remarkable achievements and tragic failures, often simultaneously. It was a system that could put humans in space while struggling to put decent shoes on their feet, that could create some of the world's greatest literature and art while censoring much of it, that could inspire genuine loyalty and patriotism while driving its citizens to drink and despair. The people who lived through this experiment developed skills, perspectives, and cultural adaptations that were uniquely suited to their circumstances. They learned to find freedom within constraint, to create meaning within absurdity, and to maintain hope despite repeated disappointments. Their stories remind us that human resilience and creativity can flourish under the most unlikely circumstances, and that the quest for dignity, community, and meaning transcends any political or economic system. The Soviet Union was many things: a utopian dream, a bureaucratic nightmare, a military superpower, an economic basket case, and a social laboratory that produced some of humanity's most interesting adaptations to impossible circumstances. But perhaps most importantly, it was home to millions of ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives simply by getting through each day with their sanity, dignity, and sense of humor intact. They stood in lines that would have tested the patience of saints, worked jobs that existed purely for ideological reasons, and somehow managed to raise families, maintain friendships, and find joy in a system that seemed designed by people who had never actually met a human being. The Soviet citizens' relationship with time was fundamentally different from that of people in market economies. Time wasn't money. It was something you had plenty of because efficiency wasn't really the point. Soviet citizens learned to think in terms of decades rather than quarters, to plan for eventual success rather than immediate gratification, and to find meaning in process rather than outcomes. This created a different kind of patience than exists in faster, paced societies. Soviet citizens could wait for hours in line without the anxiety that would drive Western consumers to distraction. They understood that some things took time, that systems had their own rhythms, and that getting angry about delays was like getting angry at weather. Emotionally satisfying, but ultimately pointless. The Soviet approach to problem solving was similarly unique. When official channels failed, which they did regularly, people didn't typically protest or demand reform. Instead, they found workarounds, created parallel systems, and developed informal networks that could accomplish what formal systems couldn't. This wasn't resignation. It was a practical recognition that some problems couldn't be solved directly and had to be approached obliquely. Soviet citizens became masters of what we might call systemic jiu-jitsu, using the system's own weight and momentum against itself. If you couldn't get what you needed through official channels, you learned to work through unofficial ones. If you couldn't express your opinions publicly, you learned to express them privately in ways that built community and maintained sanity. If you couldn't change your circumstances, you learned to change your relationship with your circumstances. This adaptive capacity was tested repeatedly throughout Soviet history. The system lurched from crisis to crisis, from the collectivization famines of the 1930s through the purges, World War II, the Cold War tensions, and the economic stagnation of the 1970s and 1980s. Each crisis required new forms of adaptation, new survival strategies, and new ways of maintaining hope when official optimism rang hollow. The purges of the Stalin era were particularly traumatic because they targeted not just political opponents, but ordinary citizens whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, knowing the wrong people, or having the wrong background. Families learned to survive by forgetting inconvenient relatives, burning compromising photographs, and teaching their children never to repeat certain conversations outside the home. This created a society where everyone understood that safety required constant vigilance and careful self-editing. People learned to maintain multiple versions of themselves. The public self that attended party meetings and voted in unanimous elections, the work self that fulfilled quotas and attended ideological education sessions, and the private self that existed only in kitchens and bedrooms where trusted friends could speak honestly. The psychological toll of this compartmentalization was significant, but Soviet citizens developed remarkable skills at emotional self-regulation. They learned to find authentic meaning in constrained circumstances, to maintain genuine relationships despite surveillance and suspicion, and to preserve their core values while navigating systems that often contradicted those values. Soviet humor evolved as a crucial survival mechanism, allowing people to express criticism and frustration in forms that were technically safe, but emotionally satisfying. Soviet jokes often worked on multiple levels, appearing innocent on the surface, while conveying sharp political commentary to those who understood the references. A joke about a man looking for a lost watch might really be about the search for lost time, lost opportunities, or lost hopes. The joke, telling networks that developed in Soviet society were informal but incredibly sophisticated, spreading new material across vast distances with remarkable speed. A joke that originated in Leningrad could reach Vladivostok within weeks, traveling through networks of friends, colleagues, and acquaintances who shared a common understanding of what could be said safely and what needed to remain unspoken. These humor networks served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided emotional relief, created bonds of shared understanding, and maintained alternative perspectives on official reality. They also served as informal intelligence networks, spreading information about shortages, policy changes, and social developments faster than official media could report them. The relationship between Soviet citizens and their government was often compared to a marriage that both parties knew wasn't working but neither could escape. People could love their country while hating their political system, feel proud of Soviet achievements while being frustrated by Soviet failures, and maintain loyalty to their communities while having no illusions about their leaders. This complex relationship produced its own forms of patriotism that were quite different from nationalist sentiment in other countries. Soviet patriotism was often rooted more in shared suffering than in shared triumph, more in collective endurance than in collective achievement. People were proud of what they had survived together, rather than what they had conquered separately. The cultural life that developed within these constraints was often more intense and meaningful than cultural life in societies with more freedom, but less necessity for depth. When you couldn't buy entertainment, you learned to create it. When you couldn't express certain ideas publicly, the private expression of those ideas became more precious. When books were banned, the books became more important, not less. Soviet intellectual life developed its own ecosystem of samizdat publications, underground lectures, and private discussion groups that maintained traditions of serious thought and artistic expression despite official pressure to conform. These networks preserved not just forbidden books and ideas, but also the habits of mind necessary for critical thinking and creative expression. The samizdat network, the informal system of copying and distributing banned or censored materials, was one of the most remarkable institutions of Soviet society. Using typewriters, carbon paper, and incredible patience, citizens created multiple copies of books, articles, and poems that couldn't be published officially. These copies were then passed from hand to hand through networks of trust that spanned the entire country. Reading samizdat material was both intellectual pleasure and political act, requiring not just literacy, but also courage and discretion. People who participated in samizdat networks understood that they were preserving more than just texts. They were preserving the idea that independent thought was possible and valuable, even under political systems that discouraged it. The physical act of reading samizdat, often by candlelight or lamplight, always with the awareness that discovery could bring serious consequences, created a different relationship with literature than exists in societies where books are readily available. When reading required risk, reading became more intense and memorable. When books were scarce, people read more carefully and discussed them more thoroughly. Soviet citizens often had more intimate relationships with literature than their Western counterparts. not because Soviet literature was necessarily better, but because accessing and discussing literature required more investment and carried more meaning. People memorized entire poems, not just for school assignments, but for personal pleasure and communal sharing. They could discuss novels with the kind of detailed analysis that academics might envy, because books were too precious and too rare to be read carelessly. The relationship between work and identity in Soviet society was also fundamentally different from that in market economies. Since employment was guaranteed and income differences were relatively small, people's sense of self wasn't as closely tied to their professional success or economic status. This created space for other forms of identity and self-worth that weren't dependent on market outcomes. Soviet citizens often developed rich internal lives and complex social relationships that weren't directly connected to their official roles. A factory worker might also be an accomplished poet, a dedicated chess player, or an expert on 19th century literature. Since economic advancement wasn't the primary measure of success, people had more freedom to pursue interests and develop skills that weren't directly profitable. This doesn't mean that Soviet society was somehow more enlightened or spiritual than market societies. It had its own forms of materialism, status competition, and social pressure. But the constraints of the system created different opportunities for human development, just as the freedoms of market systems create their own opportunities and limitations. The role of friendship in Soviet society was particularly important because friends often provided what institutions couldn't: reliable support, honest feedback, and genuine care. Soviet friendships were often deeper and more enduring than relationships in more mobile societies, partly because people had fewer options for changing their circumstances, and partly because trust was such a valuable commodity. Soviet citizens learned to read people carefully and to value relationships that could withstand the pressures of political surveillance, economic uncertainty, and social conformity. A friend who would share scarce goods, keep dangerous secrets, and provide emotional support during difficult times was worth more than any material possession the system could provide. These friendship networks often functioned as informal welfare systems, helping people through crises that official institutions couldn't or wouldn't address. When someone lost a job, needed medical care, or faced legal problems, their friends often provided more effective help than government agencies. This created communities of mutual aid that were both necessity and choice. People helped each other because they had to, but also because they understood that community bonds were among the few things that couldn't be taken away by political authorities. The Soviet approach to childhood and education created generations of people who were simultaneously well educated and carefully controlled, intellectually sophisticated and politically constrained. Soviet children received excellent technical education, comprehensive cultural exposure, and strong community support, but within parameters that limited certain kinds of questioning and exploration. Soviet schools emphasized collective achievement over individual excellence, cooperation over competition, and social responsibility over personal ambition. This produced students who were excellent at working in groups, who understood their obligations to their communities, and who could succeed within structured environments. But it also produced students who were less comfortable with individual initiative, personal risk-taking, and independent decision-making. The youth organizations that were central to Soviet childhood, the Young Pioneers, the Komsomol, and various sports and cultural clubs, provided genuine opportunities for leadership development, social engagement, and skill building. But they also served as mechanisms of social control, teaching children to value group approval over individual conscience and to see conformity as virtue rather than compromise. Soviet children learned early to navigate between official expectations and personal desires, between public performance and private thought. They became skilled at providing the responses that authorities wanted while maintaining their own inner lives and authentic relationships. This created a generation that was sophisticated about social performance, but sometimes uncertain about authentic self-expression. The sports culture in Soviet society deserves special mention because it was one of the few areas where excellence was genuinely celebrated and where individual achievement could serve collective goals without contradiction. Soviet athletes were heroes in ways that intellectuals and artists couldn't be, because their success reflected well on the system without raising uncomfortable questions about ideology or social organization. Soviet sports programs were comprehensive and well-funded, producing world-class athletes in virtually every sport. But more importantly, they provided ordinary citizens with opportunities for physical activity, competitive achievement, and communal celebration that weren't available in other aspects of Soviet life. Sports clubs became social centers where people could develop friendships, maintain fitness, and experience the joy of physical accomplishment. The famous Soviet hockey teams, basketball programs, and Olympic athletes weren't just entertainment. They were sources of national pride that allowed citizens to feel good about their country without having to think too carefully about politics. Sports provided a form of patriotism that was emotionally satisfying and politically safe, allowing people to celebrate Soviet achievements without endorsing Soviet policies. The collapse of the Soviet system, when it finally came in 1991, was both shocking and predictable. Shocking because the system had seemed so permanent and powerful. Predictable because Soviet citizens had been watching it slowly break down for decades. The final collapse was less like a sudden disaster and more like the moment when everyone finally admitted what they had known for years: that the emperor had no clothes and everyone had been pretending otherwise. The transition period that followed was particularly difficult for people who had spent their entire lives learning to navigate Soviet institutions and social systems. Suddenly, skills that had been valuable for decades, the ability to work within bureaucratic constraints, to find resources through informal networks, to maintain patience in the face of systemic inefficiency, were less useful than skills that had been suppressed or discouraged, like entrepreneurship, self-promotion, and competitive individualism. Many former Soviet citizens found themselves psychologically and culturally displaced in their own countries, struggling to adapt to new rules and new values, while mourning the loss of communities and certainties that, whatever their limitations, had provided structure and meaning to their lives. The freedom to complain openly about their government was liberating, but it came at the cost of losing the shared understanding and mutual support that had developed under the old system. But the adaptability that Soviet citizens had developed under the old system also served them well during the transition. People who had learned to survive food shortages could handle economic uncertainty. People who had learned to work around bureaucratic failures could navigate the chaos of emerging institutions. People who had learned to maintain hope, despite systemic problems, could envision better futures, even when the present was difficult. The legacy of the Soviet experience continues to influence the cultures of post-Soviet countries in complex ways. Some aspects of Soviet social organization, the emphasis on education, the expectation of full employment, the assumption that basic needs should be met collectively, remain popular even among people who have no nostalgia for Soviet politics. Other aspects, the suspicion of individual initiative, the preference for stability over opportunity, the assumption that authorities should make important decisions, have proven more problematic in market economies. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Soviet experience is the demonstration of human adaptability and resilience under extraordinary circumstances. Soviet citizens showed that people can maintain their humanity creativity, and community bonds even under political systems that seem designed to suppress those qualities. They prove that the human need for meaning, dignity, and authentic relationship is stronger than any ideology or institution. The Soviet Union was ultimately a 70-year experiment in organizing human society according to abstract principles rather than human needs. Like most such experiments, it produced results that were both more impressive and more tragic than anyone anticipated. It showed that human beings are capable of remarkable achievements when their energies are focused and coordinated, but also that human beings need freedom, choice, and authentic expression to flourish as individuals and communities. The people who lived through this experiment were neither the heroic socialist citizens of official propaganda, nor the oppressed victims of Western stereotypes. They were complex human beings who adapted to extraordinary circumstances with remarkable creativity, who found ways to live meaningful lives within meaningful constraints, and who preserved essential human values, even when those values weren't officially supported. Their stories remind us that political and economic systems are means, not ends, and that the ultimate test of any system is whether it allows people to live with dignity, to form authentic relationships, and to find meaning in their daily existence. By that measure, the Soviet system was clearly imperfect, but the people who lived within it created islands of humanity that transcended its limitations and preserved possibilities that outlasted its collapse. In the end, the most remarkable thing about Soviet society wasn't its achievements or failures as a political system, but its demonstration of the incredible human capacity to create meaning, community, and joy under even the most challenging circumstances. Soviet citizens showed that the human spirit is more resilient than any ideology, more creative than any plan, and more enduring than any institution. Their legacy isn't the system they lived under, but the humanity they preserved and expressed. Despite that system's attempts to constrain it,